Picture a meeting, a big one, important people, expensive room. Someone has pinned a giant map to the wall. The map is of a continent none of the people in that room are from, a continent most of them have never even visited. In fact, only 2 representatives in the entire room had ever stepped foot on African soil. And yet, over the next 104 days, these men, all European, all male, would sit around a horseshoe-shaped table and divide that continent among themselves. They drew lines on a map, lines that became borders, borders that became countries, countries that millions of people still live inside today. The meeting was called the Berlin Conference. It opened on November 15th, 1884, and closed on February 26th, 1885. 104 days, 14 countries represented, 0 Africans in the room. Welcome to Explain It Like I'm from Uganda. I'm Tobias. And today, we're going back to the room where, arguably, many of the modern problems of this continent were shaped. Not because looking back changes the past, but because you can't understand where you are until you understand how you got here. To understand Berlin in 1884, you first have to understand Europe in the late 1800s. Europe was deep in the Industrial Revolution. Factories were booming, railways were expanding, steam engines were changing everything, and European economies were hungry for raw materials. Rubber, cotton, ivory, minerals. Africa had all of it. Now, Africa wasn't some mysterious, unknown place to Europeans. They had been trading with African kingdoms for centuries. Coastal cities, merchant agreements, trading routes, all of that already existed. What changed was the scale of European ambition. Trading was no longer enough. They wanted ownership. And whenever multiple powerful countries want the same thing at the same time, conflict usually follows. By 1884, Britain, France, Portugal, Belgium, and Germany were all competing for African territory. Britain and France were clashing in West Africa. Portugal and Belgium were arguing over the Congo. Germany had recently decided it wanted colonies too, which irritated everyone else. So German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck did what politicians often do when tensions rise. He called a meeting, not to ask Africans what they wanted, but to help Europeans divide Africa without going to war with each other. That was the real purpose of the Berlin Conference. Not to help Africa, not to develop Africa, not to consult Africa. Africa was the prize, not the participant. The conference opened on a Saturday afternoon in Berlin at Bismarck's official residence on Wilhelmstrasse. Representatives from 14 countries sat around a horseshoe-shaped table in a room overlooking a garden. On the wall hung a huge map of Africa. Historian Professor Godfrey Uzoigwe later described it as hanging like a question mark. Honestly, that feels accurate. The countries present were Austria-Hungary, Belgium, Denmark, France, Germany, Great Britain, Italy, the Netherlands, Portugal, Russia, Spain, Sweden-Norway, the Ottoman Empire, and the United States. The United States eventually chose not to sign the final agreement because American politics at the time had started turning against imperial expansion. Everyone else signed. Now here's one detail that says a lot. The Sultan of Zanzibar actually requested permission to attend the conference. He was an African leader whose territory, trade routes, and people were directly affected by what was being discussed. His request was dismissed. Publicly, the conference was framed as a humanitarian effort. The official language talked about protecting native tribes, ending the slave trade, and bringing civilization. Historians later gave this narrative a name: the civilizing mission. The idea that European expansion into Africa wasn't conquest, but charity. Not extraction, but education. Not occupation, but upliftment. And somehow, that framing lasted for decades. The conference eventually produced something called the General Act of the Berlin Conference, signed in February 1885. It established freedom of trade in the Congo Basin, freedom of navigation along the Congo and Niger rivers, and rules for how European countries could claim African territory moving forward. But the most important idea introduced there was something called effective occupation. The rule basically said this: if a European country wanted to claim African land, it had to physically occupy it. At first glance, that sounds reasonable, but in practice, it triggered a race. Before Berlin, European claims were vague: a flag here, a treaty there, a coastal settlement somewhere else. Effective occupation changed the rules. If you wanted territory, you had to actually move in and control it. So they did, all of them, at once. And the scramble for Africa exploded into something almost frantic. Here's the number that really puts it into perspective. In 1870, only about 10% of Africa was under European control. By 1914, just 29 years after the conference, that number had jumped to 90%, from 10% to 90% in less than 3 decades. Only 2 African countries remained independent: Ethiopia, which defeated Italy at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, and Liberia, whose connection with the United States made colonization difficult. Everyone else was colonized. Now we need to talk about King Leopold II of Belgium, because his story reveals what the Berlin Conference really became. Leopold never attended the conference personally, but he may have been its biggest winner. For years, he had been carefully positioning himself to gain control of the Congo, not for Belgium, but for himself personally. He hired explorer Henry Morton Stanley to travel through the Congo Basin and secure treaties with local leaders. Treaties written in languages those leaders often didn't understand. And in Berlin, European powers officially recognized Leopold's claim. One man was handed control of the Congo Free State, a territory about 2.3 million square kilometers in size, roughly 76 times larger than Belgium itself. The conference documents claimed Leopold would protect the local population and improve their well-being. What actually happened became one of the worst atrocities of the colonial era. Leopold ran the Congo like a private business. The main product was rubber. Villagers were assigned rubber quotas. If they failed to meet them, soldiers punished them brutally. Hands were cut off and presented as proof that bullets hadn't been wasted. Children, adults, entire communities terrorized. Historians estimate that around 10 million people died during Leopold's rule through violence, starvation, disease, and forced labor. Meanwhile, Leopold became incredibly wealthy. He used that money to build palaces and parks in Belgium, then donated many of them to the Belgian state when he died. As a gift, he died in 1909, internationally praised for his philanthropic work in Africa. Eventually, after journalists and activists exposed the horrors in the Congo, international pressure forced Belgium to take the territory from Leopold in 1908. It became the Belgian Congo, gained independence in 1960, and today is the Democratic Republic of Congo. The same country that produces most of the world's cobalt while still ranking among the poorest nations on Earth. The receipts connect. Now let's talk about borders, because this is where the consequences of Berlin become impossible to ignore. The men in Berlin drew borders using straight lines, rivers, mountain ranges, and existing colonial claims. What they ignored was the actual reality on the ground. Ethnic groups, languages, kingdoms, trade networks, sacred sites, migration routes, families, all invisible to the men at that table. Take the U people in West Africa. One people, one culture, one language. After colonization, they were split across modern-day Ghana, Togo, and Benin. 3 colonial systems, 3 administrative languages, 3 governments. The Somali people were divided across 5 territories. The Luo people ended up spread between Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and Sudan. The same families suddenly found themselves living under different flags, laws, and systems. And the reverse happened too. Groups that had little in common, and in some cases had been rivals for generations, were placed inside the same borders and told, "Congratulations, you are now one country. Govern yourselves together." You've probably heard people use the term tribalism in Africa, almost like ethnic conflict is some natural African condition. But that explanation skips over the systems that deliberately created those tensions. Colonial administrations often empowered one group over another, usually whichever group cooperated most with colonial rule. Then, after independence, when conflict exploded, it was described as ancient tribal hatred. Rwanda is one of the clearest examples. The Hutu and Tutsi had lived alongside each other for centuries. Belgian colonial authorities later formalized those identities, issued ethnic ID cards, and gave preferential treatment to Tutsis in education and government. The resentment that followed wasn't random. It was built into the structure. In 1994, around 800,000 people were killed in 100 days. The world called it tribal conflict, but the system behind it traces back to colonial engineering. Former Tanzanian President Julius Nyerere once said, "We have artificial nations carved out at the Berlin Conference in 1884. And today, we are struggling to build these nations into stable societies." And honestly, that still feels true. When African countries gained independence in the 1950s and 60s, another difficult decision had to be made. In 1964, the Organization of African Unity agreed to keep colonial borders largely intact. The logic was practical. Redrawing borders across the continent could trigger endless wars. And to be fair, that concern was real. But it also meant that newly independent African countries inherited political structures they didn't design, like moving into a house someone else built for you. The walls are in strange places, the doors don't quite work, the foundation doesn't match the land underneath it. And still, you have to live there. What's interesting is how differently this history is remembered depending on where you learn it. In many Western school systems, the Berlin Conference is treated like a paragraph, a quick mention before moving on to World War I, as though dividing an entire continent was just an administrative event. But for Africa, it never ended. The borders are still here. The economic systems are still here. The infrastructure designed to extract resources instead of connect communities is still here. Now, none of this means African governments have no responsibility for the continent's present challenges. They absolutely do. And not every modern issue can be traced back to one conference room in Berlin. That would be too simplistic. But understanding the foundation matters. Understanding what was done, how it was done, who benefited, and who paid the price, that's not self-pity, that's diagnosis. And you can't fix a problem you refuse to understand properly. So, the Berlin Conference, November 1884 to February 1885. 14 countries, one horseshoe table, a giant map hanging like a question mark, and not a single African voice in the room. In just 104 days, European powers formalized one of the most consequential restructurings of a continent in modern history. They turned hundreds of kingdoms, cultures, and systems into colonies. They handed one man ownership of a massive part of another continent. They drew borders that split families, merged enemies, and created the political map Africa still navigates today. And according to the official documents, all of this was supposedly done for the benefit of African people. The Sultan of Zanzibar asked to attend. They said no. And honestly, that detail says everything. Not the borders, not Leopold, not even the quotas. Just the fact that a man whose future was being discussed knocked on the door, and the people inside decided he didn't belong in the conversation. That is the Berlin Conference. And the reason it still matters in 2026 is because the consequences are still alive. The borders are still there. The structures are still there. And many of the choices made in those 104 days still shape Africa today. Knowing that is the beginning of something. Maybe not the solution, but definitely the beginning. That's episode 5. I'm Tobias, and this is Explain It Like I'm from Uganda. New episode every Saturday. Share this with someone who thinks Africa's problems started at independence. Tell them to go back a little further, back to a horseshoe table in Berlin, 1884.